Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our event on the digital transformation, whether the Recovery and Resilience Facility and the fund and the country-specific proposals which were made can help make a big step in accelerating the digitalization of the European Union. This fund, I think, was widely celebrated as a historical movement or a historical novelty in the European Union, because this is the first time when European Union member states borrowed jointly for projects which will be distributed across the whole European Union. This fund consists of both grants and loans. Countries can apply for both grants and loans. Now, so far, 23 countries submitted their national plans. And of these 23 countries, 7 requested loans. So apparently the demand for loans is not as widespread as the demand for grants. Nevertheless, if the full amount of grants will be allocated, and also a couple of countries apply for loans, then the total funding from this facility could still be around about 500 billion euros. And one of the requirements for spending this money is that at least 20% of the total amount should be spent on digitalization. And the major scope of our event today is indeed to discuss the digital components of these plans. And I'm very honored to have a very distinguished group of speakers with me to discuss these issues. So let me briefly introduce them in alphabetic order. So we have Sam Blakey, who is a partner from the Advisory Corporate Finance Division of Deloitte. We have Maria Teresa Fábregas Fernández, who is the director of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force of the European Union. Then we have G. Scott Marcus, my colleague, a senior fellow at Bruegel. And last but not least, we have Ben Werschner, the chief economist and head of public affairs from Vodafone Group, who I think will join us very shortly. Now, before first asking Ms. Fábregas Fernández to provide some introductory thoughts and a general introduction to this facility, let me draw your attention that last week we have published with several Bruegel colleagues a data set on the recovery and resilience plans, in which we collected a large number of information about these plans and try to organize and try to compare countries according to what plans they plan to do. And certainly regarding the digital component, every country plans at least 20% on the spending on digital. But what we have also noticed is that even within the digital plans, individual member states proposed rather different priorities. For example, the European Commission set 7 flagship spending categories for this recovery fund, of which 3 related to green and 4 related to digitalization. Of these 4, one is Connect, which is rollout of rapid broadband services. The second one is Modernize, and in particular, the digitalization of public administration. The third one is Scaling Up, including data cloud capacities and sustainable processors. And the fourth one is Reskill and Upskill, primarily related to education and support of digital skills. And when we looked at the composition of country plans according to these 4 major flagship areas, we notice very large differences. For example, in Poland, almost half of total digital spending would be spent on the Connect category, so on rapid broadband services. By, for example, Portugal and Hungary and Greece would spend very, very little. while, for example, for Denmark would spend almost 3/4 on the digitalization of public administration and so on. So what we really noticed is that countries do, at least proposed, many different plans. Certainly a very important issue is that, I mean, the digital needs of every country is different, and hopefully these countries presented plans which address their country-specific issues. Now, and the final introductory remark is that after the submission of a national recovery plan, the European Commission has 2 months to evaluate those plans and make a recommendation for the Council. And the first of these plans was submitted by Portugal on the 22nd of April. So it means that by the 22nd of June, the latest, the European Commission will publish its first evaluation of the plan for Portugal. And there were a couple of other countries that also submitted their plans still in April. So by the end of this month, in a few weeks, in 2-3 weeks from now, we will see about 5-8 assessments by the European Commission, which will be very, very interesting. But certainly today we cannot discuss those assessments because these are on preparation. But instead we will more focus on some general features of this of the plans, and also what to expect. But also some of the colleagues in the panel have already looked at national plans, so hopefully they can also say their own assessments. So after this introduction, let me first pass the floor to Maria Teresa Fabregas Fernandez for some initial kickoff remarks about Next Generation EU and its digital component. So Maria Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting the European Commission to this important and very relevant panel. And thank you, Zsolt, for your introduction and presentation, which is framing very well the discussion that we are going to have. So I'm going to be very short, but explaining a bit the framework, the legal framework in particular, under which this discussion on digital transformation under the Recovery and Resilience Facility is taking place. So digital transformation is one of the 6 pillars defining the scope of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And it supports the digital transition as part of the general objectives of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So as Zsolt mentioned, the Recovery and Resilience Facility requires that each Recovery and Resilience plan allocates at least 20% of its budget to measures supporting the digital transition or addressing the challenges resulting from it. And this is done in a very
recording in progress.
It's done in a very specific way with detailed requirements. In Annex 7 of the regulation, there are the specific intervention fields and the specific coefficients for the specific measures that member states will be introduced in order to calculate this 20%. So beyond this obligation of the 20% for the digital target, at least 20%, another requirement that member states have to fulfill is to address country-specific recommendations. So here, member states have to take into consideration the 2019 and 2020 country-specific recommendations in all the fields, but also in particular in the field of the digital transition, and introduce measures, reforms, and investments that will address those. So in this regard, if we look at these country-specific recommendations, we see the link with the digital transition in the recommendations that are related to education and skills, to connectivity, to research and development, to digitalization of public services, to business environment, for instance. And what is important also is that all these measures that member states will be introducing in their plans contribute to having a lasting impact on the economy and society. Zsolt mentioned the flagships that the European Commission indicated in this communication called 2021 Annual Sustainable Growth Strategy. So these were indications that last September, the European Commission suggested to member states. However, they are not enshrined as such in the regulation. Therefore, we cannot use them as an assessment criteria when we will be when we are assessing the plans. But they are important key reference because at the end of the day, as Joel highlighted, they relate very much to these country-specific recommendations I was highlighting. Also, an area on which we pay a lot of attention is on the multi-country projects, and in particular in the field of digital transition. They are very relevant, and I have to thank here the colleagues from DG Connect with whom we have been working, and they have been working very hard with member states in order to encourage member states also to bring in some multi-country projects supporting the digital transition. Another legal requirement in the Recovery and Resilience Facility is the do no significant harm, meaning that all measures in every single plan have to comply with the do no significant harm to the environment. There are specific criteria for that. The European Commission issued a technical notice explaining how this is going to be applied. And so member states, they have to present their own plan. Is the member state plan. So it's a member state plan that has to comply with the legal requirements. And in this plan, member states have to detail their reforms and investments. Reforms are key. Reforms are very important because the reforms are going to reinforce and complement the proposed investments, and therefore ensuring a lasting impact, creating the appropriate ecosystem, I would say, framework in order to make sure that the investments have a lasting impact. And in the area of digital transition, we can see that some of the reforms relate to modernization of the public service, where there are these processes of simplification, removal of bottlenecks to investments, issues linked to licensing, authorization procedures, issues linked, for instance, digitalization of the judicial system is not just digitalization. It means also to simplify procedures and to make processes smoother. So this on the side of reforms, and then on the side of investments, of course, as also highlighted by Joel at the start, there are investments that we are seeing in the plans that relate to connectivity, to upskilling, reskilling, to cloud technology, data technologies, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, to many, many different areas that are linked, as said, to the country-specific recommendations in particular. And what I'd like to highlight is that all these investments have to comply with state aid rules. So the state aid rule process that is managed by DG Competition in the European Union has to go in parallel to the process related to the assessment of the recovery and resilience plans. We have received at this stage 23 recovery and resilience plans. We are assessing these plans and assessing them in accordance with the specific detailed criteria that appear in the Annex 5 of the regulation. And these criteria are 11 criteria, very well detailed, with clear description about how the Commission has to assess the plans. We have 2 months, and we will be issuing within these 2 months the proposals for Council implementing decisions, accompanied by a staff working document explaining our assessment, and then the Council will have 1 month in order to approve this Council implementing decision. From the European Commission side, with regard to the digital transformation, what we consider is that these plans will contribute to the digital decade strategy, but not only the recovery and resilience facility funding. There are many other types of EU funding, going from Digital Europe to InvestEU, Creative Europe, and several other funds at European level that can contribute to the achievement of this digital transformation. And in this regard also, of course, national funds, and in particular, if investments and reforms are well done, crowding in private investment for this transition, the digital transition. So it's a performance-based facility, the recovery and resilience facility. So we'll have to, from the Commission side, first check that the relevant milestones and targets indicating that reforms and investments are achieved, are complied with, are fulfilled in order then to be able to disburse the funding. And what is key in this process, and these are my last words, is implementation. And during the implementation process, as said, will be, and when I say we, it means all the Commission, because we are working with all the services of the Commission. We will be involved in monitoring with the Member State the progress in achieving these milestones and targets. But the key message we are transmitting to all Member States is that we really encourage them to involve all relevant stakeholders or authorities to be engaged and involved in the process of the implementation in order to make sure that the implementation of the plans is a real success. So thank you, and looking forward for listening to the other speakers and the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa, for this broad overview, framing how the Recovery and Resilience Facility and the national plans fit into the broader European digital agenda. Let me have two short, quick follow-up questions. So you mentioned the European Commission's digital decade strategy, and also mentioned that the Recovery and Resilience Facility is just one component of that. There are InvestEU and many others. I just wonder if you can make a broad assessment, how important is the Recovery and Resilience Facility in the overall digital decade strategy? And my second question, which could be perhaps even more difficult, is that do you have any estimate what is the share of public and private investment needs in reaching the digital goals? Because certainly a lot has been done by the public sector, quite obviously. But as you also mentioned, one of the goals of all of these instruments is to involve the private sector. But is there any estimate roughly how much public-private investment should be made in order to meet the digital decade goals? So back to you, please.
Thank you. So concerning your first question, now with regard to how much is the percentage of contribution from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or the Recovery and Resilience plans in particular, to the digital decade strategy. At this stage, it's not easy to say, because as you highlighted yourself, we have 23 plans that we have received. But concerning, for instance, the envelope related to loans, not all member states have at this stage decided to go ahead to launch. So it's quite difficult to have the overall envelope. So I don't have a reply today on this. Maybe in 3 years' time, because member states have until 2023 to present additional plans and to come back for the loans or to modify their plans, we might be able to have this figure. And then with regard to your second question on private public investment needs, with regard to the digital goals, actually, I think that this is more of a question specifically for our colleagues in DG Connect, and unfortunately, I don't have the answer either. So it should be addressed to them. Thank you.
Thank you. So it means there are still many interesting questions to explore, and I hope we will also explore some of them today. So let me now turn to Sam Blakey, who will hopefully also speak about how to turn all of these plans into practice. So Sam, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Zoltan. And I think actually the segue between what Maria Teresa was talking about and what I was planning to talk about is actually quite neat, because what I wanted to explore a little bit was actually the degree of alignment between the overall digital decade targets and how those play into the RRFs. So obviously the digital decade targets are, a very important part of the ambition in terms of helping Europe recover from COVID-19, and I think probably more widely in terms of helping ensure that Europe remains economically competitive in a sort of globalized world that we live in. And those targets, very high level, revolve around deployment of high-speed networks, increasing digitalization of public services, improving the capability of SMEs and the people of Europe in terms of digital skills. And those plans themselves actually are pretty ambitious. I mean, the one that always sticks in my mind is the ambition of having 100% gigabit connectivity by 2030, which I think is very, very bold in its ambition. And they have themselves then pretty important implications for the degree of infrastructure investment required, as well as skills development. Particularly so given that the ambition is to be delivered by 2030, which, as we all know, in infrastructure terms is right around the corner. So what we wanted to do was then have a look at how those plans align with the recovery and resilience funds, which I think we talked about how much has been sort of claimed so far. I believe the total size of the fund is even bigger than what's been claimed so far, around sort of 700 billion or slightly less than that. And the two are obviously not tied together, but they do overlap quite a lot. So we're obviously very delighted when Vodafone asked us to help sort of do a little piece of research around this. So what I'll do is I'll just say a few words on how we did the work, and then come on to what we thought we found. I think it's important to say at the outset, in doing the comparison between the two, what we were not trying to do was saying whether the plans, either in aggregate or at a country level, were right or wrong. We were just looking at the level of alignment between the two. It's also worth saying that when we did this initial piece of work I'll talk primarily around today, a lot of the plans hadn't yet been submitted, so it's a sort of partial view that we are in the process of fleshing out as more plans were submitted. So we looked at the first 12 that were submitted in the sort of first half of May. Helpfully though, those 12 were from a geographically diverse range of countries, as well as including some of the larger European economies such as Germany and Denmark, and the ones that seem to be taking the most down through the RRF, such as Italy and Spain. And for each of those countries, we effectively asked two questions. The first was, if you look at the historical performance of those countries versus the digital decade targets, are they trending towards hitting those targets without material additional interventions? And if the answer to that is no, does it look like that there are clear plans within the RRF that would be significant to bridge the gap? And within that, I totally take Maria Teresa's point that there are other funds available, but there's a limit to what we were able to do at the time. So when we went through the findings, I think they're genuinely interesting. I mean, there does appear to be clearly a lot of money going in, but nevertheless some I think material gaps still showing across the majority of the targets we looked at. So if I take infrastructure as an example of that, so the EIB, and this goes a little bit to your question earlier, Zolt, around public versus private. I think they had estimated something like 350 billion combined public and private funding needed to meet the infrastructure targets by 2025. Of which they'd estimated around 200 billion would need to be funded by the public sector. So when we look through the RRFs, we found around about 100 billion was clearly earmarked, and so there's still a material gap around 100 billion there. Now some of that will come from countries that we haven't yet looked at, and some of that may come through more effective crowding in. And so this is where we are. Sort of the analysis is still not complete, but I think given the scale of it, it does feel like you will still get to a material gap at the end of that. Similarly, if you look at just to pick another example, something like digital skills, one element of the target would involve an additional 13 million people trained up as ICT specialists by 2030. When we look through the RRFs, we found, if you just think about sort of typical costs of funding an ICT specialist, probably enough for another 2 million. Again, more will come through, I'm sure, the additional plans. And some of it may be plans that are not necessarily specific, but the intention is there. But again, that did point to there being a sort of potential material gap in that space. And then finally, on the digital capability of SMEs. So the target there is around 90%. And I think the European average, based on the DESI index, is something around 60% at the minute. Now, that's not a huge gap, but it has been pretty stable at around 60% for a while. And when we went through the RRFs, we found around 28 billion of funding clearly allocated to addressing that, which is, in anybody's money, substantial amount of funding going through. But when you put it in context of what the SMEs are currently spending, that works out at about 10% of the current digitalisation spend by SMEs. So that's not to say that that's can't bridge the gap, but I think it raises some questions about whether there will be additional measures needed. So I guess in terms of where this leaves us, our view, notwithstanding we haven't yet finished all the analysis, it does look like there are some material areas of gaps. Some of that, exactly as Maria-Teresa said, is going to need to be crowding in of additional private sector investment. But I really struggle to see that will be enough in its own right. And I think there will be areas, and particularly areas like rural deployment, where it's just difficult to see the business cases backing up, where there will need to be additional targeted public sector investments. Just to mention very briefly in terms of where we are, so we're in the process of finalising our work now, and there will be a forthcoming report that will extend the sort of 12-country analysis we've done so far up to a much wider set of countries, and I believe that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. But from everything we're seeing so far, the fundamental messages are likely to stay broadly as I've described today, albeit numbers will change a bit. I think that's everything from me, Zoltz. Back to you.
Thank you, Sam. So thank you, Sam, so much for introducing the first result of your analysis of 10 plans, 12 plans, sorry, which is very, very interesting. And in fact, it's a kind of warning that you identify that even after you take into account these plans, significant gaps remain in a number of areas. Now, one quick follow-up question, because you just broadly spoke about the 12 countries, but for example, not mentioning the worst countries, but can you highlight the best countries in a sense that those countries for which you foresee the smallest gaps, or even perhaps reaching at the national level these 2030 targets?
I think probably the one that stands out there is Germany, and particularly think about its infrastructure deployment, because I think they anticipate meeting the target in 2026 rather than 2030, and that I think is a combination of intelligently using the RRF, but also a substantial amount of funding coming out of the national broadband plan from Germany in addition to the RRF. I actually should have made that point earlier, Zoltz. It's a very important point that when we've looked at the cost of infrastructure and the gap, we have accounted for what's in the national broadband plans, which is actually the majority of the funding. So I should clarify that sort of 100 million gap I said is net of those additional funds.
And another quick follow-up question. I mean, if you compare what is coming from national sources and EU sources, I mean, you can consider all EU sources, but it's also enough if you just consider the RRF. What is the balance between of countries planning to spend between the national and EU sources?
It's a really hard question to answer, because there isn't for a lot of these targets, there isn't a central repository of the schemes that are being pursued by individual governments. So particularly thinking like skills development, like those things will be in many cases absolutely funded centrally out of education departments and the like, and it isn't an easy task to actually work out what's either what's being funded or what's being funded incrementally. The easiest is to see in the infrastructure funding where there are national broadband plans, and there is particularly say countries like Germany, they are potentially spending more than coming out of the RRF, but I think I wouldn't draw wider conclusions from that. I think there's a lot going on the individual country levels that we shouldn't skip over.
Many thanks, Sam. Now, before turning to Ben, just let me draw the attention of the audience that you can ask questions on Slido, and in fact 4 questions have already been asked, and you can also vote for a question if you think that's a particularly good question that will come on the top. I'm monitoring these questions, and after the discussion within the panel, I will ask some of those questions. So go to Slido, sli.do, and write digital recovery, and then you will see our event, and you can see the 4 questions which are already there. And again, you are welcome to select one of these if you think those are particularly important and I should ask them, or you can type your own questions and I will monitor them. But now let me turn to Ben, who I think will also discuss the Digital Decade 2030 strategy. and also the role of reforms versus investment, but might also provide some global overview of how China and US are ahead or behind us. We will shortly learn from that. So Ben, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Zsolt, and thank you, Bruegel, for hosting this event. It's a little bit challenging to go after two such rich and important contributions from Maria-Teresa and Sam, so I'll try to add a few points, but they covered a lot of very important ground in terms of the discussion at hand. But just maybe stepping back from some of the detail of the Recovery and Resilience Facility to where we are. I mean, we believe that we are at a pivotal moment in terms of the development of Europe. And we as Vodafone, with the majority of our business located in Europe, it's really important for us that the path that Europe follows in the coming years is the right path, and one which does lead to increasing prosperity for all of the member states. And within that context, as you point out, this is not something which is a self-contained issue within Europe. This is part of a global economic race. You only have to look at the US to see the amount of money that Biden is proposing to put into infrastructure, into stimulus. It is eye-watering amount of intervention that will put the US economy should be on a very strong footing in the years ahead, and Europe needs to make sure it doesn't fall behind. And in that regard, we do believe the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a great starting point, combined with the other initiatives that are in play at the moment. And also we believe that the end point, what we are trying to achieve, the digital decade targets, for us as a sector, are the right targets, and they're very bold, they're very ambitious. It's something we want industry and we want governments to fully get behind. But I think as has come apparent through the first interventions, there is no one single initiative that the Recovery and Resilience Facility in and of itself will not be sufficient to get us to 2030 and achieving all of those targets. I mean, just put it in perspective, the exact amount, whether it's 675 billion, 700 billion, 750, this is a mix of grants and loans, and we already see that member states are not taking up loans as much as they're taking up grants. So the total amount which will actually flow may be somewhat less, and with 20% going to digital, the details, as Sam, and look forward to the Deloitte report coming out shortly. The exact gap, we don't know what it will be, but it's going to be a significant gap from what will be on the table now versus what needs to be spent in order to achieve the digital decade targets. So for us, this is why I think Maria-Teresa used the phrase crowding in private investment. This is absolutely critical. And it's critical to get it to not believe this is something that you can do. Well, let's first have the funds flow and let's worry about the reforms later on. You know, we don't want to have money plowed into a system which isn't fully optimized. In order to keep up with the US, with China, we need to make sure the overall system is fully optimized, and that means doing the reforms, having as much attention to the reforms now as we have to ensuring that where the funds flow to is also the right projects, and where obviously the European Commission will have a significant oversight role to ensure that is the case. But we are confident at this point in time that the incentives and the ambitions are right. So we hear all the right, so I say, music and language being spoken about reforms, about how to ensure the funds are well spent. But the key is going to be in the implementation, in not just the months ahead, but it's going to be the years ahead as we have to go to this facility, but also the other EU funds and the member state national broadband plans. And for us, if I look at where I think there needs to be more focus, it's also ensuring that we keep the digital decade targets very much front and center, and ensure not just with these funds, but everything that is done from a policy perspective, which comes out of the Commission, but also at the member state level, there is a clear assessment of what are we doing, and does it contribute to achieving the digital decade targets, especially in terms of the money that flows to digital. And Maria-Teresa, I was very struck by your, you say, you know, the principle must do no harm, but I would flip that round and say, no, actually going beyond must do no harm, every initiative, every single proposal must be shown to be actively contributing to these very ambitious and very bold targets, because we already see risks that member states will focus investment where it doesn't yield the biggest impact on achieving the targets. And that's where we think the Commission has a very strong role to play in ensuring that is the case. And we for some time now have been talking about using the DESI index as a means of monitoring not just progress, but also monitoring initiatives and monitoring proposals. We think is it's already a very strong framework for looking at where countries are in terms of their digitalization progress. And for us, the other key part of the DESI is it doesn't just focus on connectivity. Obviously, we are broadly play along the whole sector, but we focus a lot on connectivity. But the DESI really looks at every aspect of digitalization. It looks at SMEs, as Sam said, and digital skills, the take-up of digital services. And it's really important that all of these things move hand in hand. And in another forum where we've been discussing with citizens about their views on digital, one of the points that came across was the comment that there's no point building seven-lane highways if no one knows how to drive. And it's very much the same as the case for digital. There's no point just investing in the connectivity and the infrastructure if no one knows how to use these services. And that's what's going to take Europe forward in terms of its competitiveness vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis China, is to ensure that all of these elements of the DESI go hand in hand to drive Europe's overall digitalization forward. And one other thing that we've been looking at and we think is also relevant to bring into the debate is the link between green and digital. We fully support the twin transition, and we think the Commission's got it absolutely right. These are the two biggest focuses that we should have. And really what we've learned from what we hope to look forward to a post-pandemic world where these two transitions are going to be vital. But what we think is also necessary is to actually explicitly link the two and recognize the role that digital has to play in enabling the green transformation of many other sectors and many other industrial businesses. And so if I try to summarize where I think we are, I think there's been a great reaction, and it's always challenging from a European Union perspective, trying to coordinate member states. We recognize the challenges. So to get to where we are today has been a significant achievement. We also believe that having clear goals and clear targets is the right thing, and we're very confident those are the right targets. We know public money is going to be important, and as has been repeatedly said, we know crowding in private investment is going to be important. And so the last thing I'll say is also there's a little element of how we should do this. And from the Vodafone perspective, we look at ourselves and we say, okay, actually we as a company have changed somewhat in the last few years. We've really tried to adopt what we call a social contract approach, where we work much more closely with citizens, but also closely with other parts of other sectors. We can't do this by ourselves. We've long recognized that the digital transformation is too big for a single company or a single sector to bear it all on its shoulders. So we see the partnership approach very much central to the digital transformation. And that partnership approach extends very much to government. And Sam referred to investment in rural areas. It's a key example for us. We know we need to get to all the rural areas, but we know we cannot do it by ourselves, that the business cases don't stack up. We have to have in the end, as the private sector, there has to be investment that makes sense. But we know that if we work more collaboratively with our industry peers and also with governments, we can make many more business cases add up, which will deliver much more value to citizens, to society, and it creates a virtuous cycle of positive investment, which will, again, that's the crowding in a private investment, and ensure we are able to hit those 2030 targets, which we support. Always targets should be somewhat scary, right? So it's never ones that you can just say, well, we'll achieve that with no sweat at all. So they are challenging, but I think many of the pieces are in play, and we're confident that we will get there with the right attitude, with the right approaches, and with this holistic approach whereby both every initiative is measured against, does it contribute to hitting those targets? And if it doesn't, we should be doing something else. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Scholt.
Many thanks, Ben, also for this quite interesting overview and emphasizing the important role of the right targets. Now, let me also have two quick follow-up questions to you. First, you mentioned that we should have the right targets. For example, we shouldn't build a 7-lane highway for cars if we don't use any cars and no traffic is there. But at the same time, you said that you are generally positive about the digital decade target. So my first question is indeed, is it an unconditional support for the digital decade targets? Or if you were in a position to suggest changes to that, what amendments would you propose? And if already you see anything in the national plans which go along the lines which would be in your proposal? So that's my first question. And the second question is related to more the global race, as you mentioned that there is a global race with other participants. So how do you assess the current level of digitalization and digital development in Europe, let's say compared to the US and China? And if we will reach the digital decade goals by 2030, where would that lead us? So if I presume we are still lagging the US, but would the 2030 targets make us closer or even reach or surpass the US? So what's your view on these issues?
Okay, so just going on to the targets. So it's almost an unequivocal support for the, in the end it's 2030, so that they are long-term ambitious targets. But for me, the real question is two things. Number one is how. It's not the what, it's the how. And I'll just make 2 points on the how that I think are important. Firstly, is understanding the prioritization. So on the 2030 targets, there's lots of different elements. But we have to be clear that there's no point trying to focus on, I don't know, supercomputing or huge progress on AI if we don't have the connectivity layer first. So there needs to be a prioritization in terms of setting those targets or managing the implementation of those targets. So that on the how is making not to get lost in some of the more ambitious shiny new toy syndrome, should I say, without getting the basics right. Get the basics right, and then let the others follow from that. But the how is also on those targets. I said that we support the targets, but what we don't see yet is the real means to achieve them. If we look at what is actually proposed at the moment. So on the taking the recovery, the national plans, there needs to be far greater reforms on connectivity. If we believe that connectivity is the first most important basics to get right in order to achieve mass digitalization across the entire continent, then get that layer right first and recognize that the crowding in of private investment means fundamental reforms as to how the connectivity sector is regulated, enabled, nurtured, etc. So that I would say in terms of digital decade targets. So you're set on the second question. I didn't quite get it all down. I think on US-China, there's a little bit of a comparison. The one thing I say is what maybe this is a slightly controversial view, but I worry that when you look at the value that flows around the digital ecosystem, a huge amount of that value is being extracted outside of the EU. And it almost seems like the EU's response is to extract it back through fines and regulation, which is not really, just yesterday, obviously, Google got fined by the French authorities on its ad tech product. And we're seeing increasing level of fines of the US tech giants, but it doesn't resolve the fundamental issue that we're not seeing the European companies involved in as much in the innovation of new technologies and driving that value in the digital ecosystem. And so for us, really, we see the resetting of the digital ecosystem space and having much stronger EU companies emerging. And we see from a sort of a connectivity sector the need to work more collaboratively with our peers in order to create the scale across the EU to enable that to happen. That's one of the important things we want to see coming up in the years ahead. So there's always been a lot of resistance to European companies that appear to compete against each other, collaborating with each other. We see a lot of resistance, for example, just on network sharing from a competition perspective. But we think this is really going to be important to drive the European scale to compete with the other parts of the world, where we see more innovation from the US companies and also from the Chinese companies. So that's where we hope to see a little bit of a resetting of the expectations of what we are and what we're not allowed to do with our peers to drive this partnership approach and to drive the European scale that is necessary to fully compete in the global race.
Very clear comments. Many thanks. Now, Scott, last but not least, I know you have looked at the German plan, so you might also, the digital component of the German plan. Sam also mentioned Germany as a good example. So I would also wonder whether you have a view on that, and also any other aspects. Whether the plans are additional or what role the Recovery and Resilience Facility can play in reaching the digital decade goals. So, Scott.
Thank you very much, Schultz. Okay, well, in fact, I'm delighted to. First, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure to be able to follow such a talented and knowledgeable group of speakers. I'd actually like to start by bumping the discussion up a little bit and saying, what in the digital space are we trying to achieve? and what are we trying to achieve with RRF? Certainly with the Recovery and Resilience Fund, it could be viewed largely as Keynesian stimulus to the economy in the wake of the pandemic, but that's clearly not the main point or the only point. In one of the Bruegel events about 6 months ago, the German finance minister Olaf Scholz put it, I thought, very succinctly when he said, if we use this jolt of money only to rebuild things as they were, we will have done a great disservice to future generations. The point is, we should be using this as a historic opportunity to correct some of the deficits in European society as they relate to key areas. And the two that have been chosen, I think rightly, are indeed digitalization and green sustainability. So to me, that's really the key bits here. Now, if we look at the European strategy as embodied in Digital Compass, Digital Decade, I would say that a lot of things here have been gotten right. A lot of these address historic issues that have been well known for a long time. The change here is, thanks to RRF and also other instruments, there's a chance to lay down some bigger chips on the table than have historically been played in a number of areas that have needed attention for many years. So first on the, okay, so there's four main pillars: businesses, public services, connectivity, skills. Starting with the businesses, this goal about having 90% of SMEs having basic skills, it's really important here that we've got some real attention to this, hopefully being paid. It's been known for a long time, the best companies in Europe, especially the best large companies, probably make as good use of ICTs as the best companies anywhere. Our large companies tend to be progressive and modern. It's been known for a long time that SMEs, first off, we have a lot of SMEs in Europe, and frequently their use of ICT technology has been relatively weak. As we heard, we're talking about a 60% based on indicators like DESI. It's not where it ought to be. It's not where we should want it to be as Europeans. We need to be competitive in this area. It's good to see some concerted attention hopefully paid here. Another has to do with innovation, and this loops exactly back to Ben's thoughtful comments. So we need more innovation. Europe doesn't do that badly on startups. We do quite badly when it comes to scaling them up. We're weak on IPOs. We're weak on equity capital and especially venture capital for them. These are all mentioned in the digital decade, in the digital compass. The need to create more EU unicorns, all mentioned. So this is important. It's not just a matter of pumping money in, and it's certainly an area where money pumped in needs to crowd in private investment as well. It won't be done solely with public investment. In a country like the United States, which performs well in this area, they would really never think of using public funding as the core, even though in fact they do quite a bit of public funding. It's not fully appreciated. Okay, so again, it's in the right direction. Public services, the idea of putting key public services online, important. Also as a means of pulling investment from many areas, as a means of creating more usage of many of the services that we're producing. For years, we've had challenges in this area, especially with cross-border services. If you look at something like e-health, the problem often isn't so much with the digitization, it's that the underlying delivery is so different among the member states. So again, concerted attention, which is there as one of the four pillars, is in the right direction. As far as skills, the focus on creating 20 million trained ICT experts instead of 7.8. Again, this is good. It's nice. It's quantitative. And with connectivity, the focus on getting full coverage of actually gigabit capable technology, won't necessarily be functioning at gigabit, and also full coverage of inhabited areas with 5G. Again, this is good. It's a very fundamental building block from which other things can be driven. So the focus is right. One of the things that's easily missed, there's an annex to that strategy that has criteria, and they're quantitative criteria. if you're going to evaluate the programs, you really need to have some quantitative measures that you can know, as we say, smart indicators. They should be measurable. So, so again, it's in the right direction. So are the targets in the RRF, are they generally aligned with this? Well, I would say they are. It looks to me like the directions are largely linked up. You can connect the dots one for one and say, by and large, the things that we're trying to encourage the member states to fund are in the right direction. They line up with a digital strategy that by and large makes sense. So this is good. Now, getting more concretely into specific funding areas, again, it's nice that Sam and his colleagues have done this. I have to say the database on funding that you, Jolt, and your colleagues published a few days ago is really helpful. In both cases, it takes heroic efforts, I would say, to try to boil the numbers down into a consistent framework. Nobody did anything wrong here, but in fact, trying to put them on a consistent frame where you can actually see how the numbers relate is truly challenging, trying to understand how much is additional to current funding, and especially trying to understand when you tot up the numbers between all of the different programs that are out there, how do they relate? So again, a very useful exercise. What we see in the numbers that your group already worked up, Jolt, is there are big differences in the way the numbers look if you look solely at the RRF. On the one hand, the percentage contribution, say in a Germany, the percentage contribution to digital is big, but it's a big percentage of a number that's smaller than in many other member states. So if you look at the absolute numbers, in Germany, you've got 15 billion that are categorized as digital out of a total of 28, a big percentage, but it's 15 billion. In Italy, you have 56 billion in the direction of digital, and out of that, 13 is for broadband out of a total of 192. So a smaller percentage, but a big number. Now, when I looked at Germany, the first thing that I was struck with is there's nothing there for broadband. And I scratched my head for a second. I said, well, wait a minute. Germany's been doing broadband plans for a long time. And so, in fact, you really have to think about how the plans all tot up together in order to make meaningful comparisons. The large contributions that are visible in the work that your team did, Jolt, are 13 billion in Italy, 5 billion in Poland, and 11 billion in Spain for the connectivity pillar, which is basically the broadband pillar. In the other member states that your folks looked at, none of them were more than 2 billion, and many of them were much less. That doesn't mean that less money is being spent. If you add the money coming in from all other sources, from national facilities, perhaps cohesion funds, all of the other places that money could come from, we may get a different picture. So again, trying to understand the totality, I think, is going to be a complicated exercise. Okay, coming back to the very fine introduction that Maria Teresa made at the beginning, focus on multi-country projects. That's very visible in Digital Decade, Digital Compass. And there, a lot of the projects, again, seem promising. I think there's going to be a need for more of these. But things, for example, like 5G rail corridors. Well, you don't need rail corridors so much, at least they're not so critical in terms of bandwidth for operational rail, the kind of facilities that enable the train drivers to avoid accidents. But if we want to enable people to be able to use their smartphones or their laptops while they're in trains, that almost certainly will require some public funding. I've done work for the rail sector, and you know, basically a lot of those train routes go through areas that are not very heavily populated. If it weren't for the trains, and if it weren't for probably some public subsidy or other supporting measures, you won't get full coverage and people will be constantly interrupted as they are today. So again, many of the bits there, the bits about research in low power processors, quantum computing, connected public administration, many of those multi-country initiatives potentially make sense. Again, there'll be complementarities here, there'll be additionality. All of it is going to take a lot of work, I think, for people like us, for think tanks, and also I'm sure for Maria Teresa's group to fully understand. So again, more analysis needed, more work. Coming back to what Maria Teresa said at the outset, there's a lot of good stuff happening here. but key is going to be implementation, and also key is going to be monitoring. Think about the kind of evaluation that we have in the Better Regulation program. Getting it right is going to take hard, sustained attention. And that, I think, is where the challenges will be going forward. And with that, back to you, Joel. Thank you very much, by the way, this is a great panel.
Thank you very much, Scott, for this very nice overview and also walking us through for the four main priorities, and also how these are related to the broader digital targets. Now, we received many questions, and one question already relates to what you have said. So it is related to 5G. I mean, you mentioned 5G access on trains, and there is a question whether there is any what information we have on supporting the 5G infrastructure. So I don't know, Scott, if you found something or that in the German plan that you have looked at or not.
Well, in the German RRF submission in the national plan, I can't find a word about broadband. And as I say, I don't think that means that broadband is ignored. I think that means that whatever they're doing in other ways. The national broadband plans are actually not so easy to assess. You know, they pose many of the same challenges that we're seeing here. There was a study done for the Commission in 2016 of national broadband plans, and it said all of the member states have a broadband plan. In some cases, they have 2 or 3 plans that seem to relate to broadband, but trying to add them up and make sense of them is not such an easy task. Again, I'd be a little hesitant to try to draw too much out of those. Since the question is posed specifically in terms of Germany, you know, Germany actually faces some historic issues. The infrastructure is very well suited to older fixed network technologies, VDSL technologies, partly because of so-called short subloop lengths. The length of copper loops in the network is relatively short, which is good. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of cable in Germany. And at the moment, Ben's company is busy upgrading that cable infrastructure to DOCSIS 3.0, 3.1, which is a gigabit technology. You know, we often think solely in terms of fiber to the premise, solely to the home, but that's there. And all of this fiber, in terms of getting 5G deployed, is important because in many cases where historically base stations may have been served with less capable technology, getting fiber to the base station for the mobile networks is absolutely crucial here. So there again, you know, that's really where a lot of the attention for the mobile network has to be. For the mobile network, every mobile network is a fixed network until you get to the Airlink. So that, I think, those are key issues. In many cases, the network operators can fund this themselves. I think that also some of the points that Ben made earlier about sharing are important. Shared tower infrastructures or independent tower companies can be useful. If you look at the experience in Europe, sharing of active components, sharing of the radio access network has tended to be allowed in very few member states because of concerns over possible competitive threats. Sharing of the masts, usually permitted. There's probably more sharing possible in Europe than is actually being done today or being attempted. So there's a lot of room here to do better.
Many thanks, Scott.
A slight word on that one, just a specific question on 5G, because I think so when we looked at it, most of the plans actually did have specific references to 5G. I mean, they varied quite a bit in terms of the level of specificity. So, and some of them, it wasn't quite clear whether it was a sort of joint specification around broadband and 5G, or whether they were independent. But certainly in the majority of plans, there seem to be clear targets and clear investment tied to 5G deployment in urban areas.
Okay, many thanks, Sam, for clarifying the 5G issue. Now, let me turn to please
add to that, because I just think it's an important question. So on Germany itself, I know there's a difficult finding the exact details of subsidies, but there is a major national subsidization program that comes through sometimes at a regional level, sometimes at a national level. But there are some significant ambitions in place for ensuring connectivity everywhere in Germany. I think within that context, I think there's 2 really important points to make. And it goes back to what I said earlier about optimizing the value of every euro that is invested. So there really needs to be a careful consideration of where public money goes. So I mean, this is, I make no apologies being slightly selfish here, but we don't see the value in terms of using fiber to overbuild cable to the point that Scott just made. You know, the cable technology is a gigabit technology, and therefore there should not be public money going into creating an additional infrastructure over and above that. But also, I think it's important in terms of the investment or the subsidization of 5G where it truly is an economic. There is a long and it's an ongoing debate about the extent to which 5G is a step change. And I think we're clear that it is a step change in terms of its capabilities and what it can give for industrial use of digital. But the component which I think is sometimes forgotten is the time, or the time element. This is not just about getting things right by 2030, which is the long-term targets, but every day counts. And I think this for the Commission, when they're assessing what is permitted within the state aid framework, which is an important consideration, the extent to which having something in place 3-5 years earlier delivers value for European economies really needs to be taken into account, because there's a significant risk that things get delayed on the basis that, well, it will happen at some point in the future. But some point in the future isn't good enough when we're looking at a global economic race.
If I could just reinforce that point for a second, there's a natural temptation to think of 5G as just another G, just another generation that's faster and more cost effective. But in fact, 5G potentially is a game changer to the extent that it can support lots of different use cases. Effectively, you can slice a network up to provide many different kinds of services with different properties, different latency, different reliability, different characteristics, in a way that wasn't so easy with previous generations of the network. So that potentially enables new uses of the network, including industrial uses, including other kinds of low power uses, other kinds of process control, Internet of Things uses that maybe weren't there before, and potentially opens up a door to new kinds of innovation with important spillovers. I think that's where you were actually headed with the comment, Ben.
And if I may, so here what I like to highlight is that this comment made about we have to carefully consider where public money is going. This sentence that Ben has highlighted is key, because if there is private money that goes to specific investments, we should not crowd out that private investment with public funding, just the opposite. So what we need to find is the areas where this public money will crowd in private investment. And concerning 5G issues, of course, something that is very important is this digital divide, when we talk about geographical differences with different territories concerning connectivity in particular. But the digital divide, of course, goes beyond what is connectivity issues. Thank you.
Many thanks, Maria Teresa. And if you have the word, then let me come back to you with two questions. One which was Ben raised in his response, because Ben raised this do no harm principle. And if you can clarify what's the role of that principle, because certainly it doesn't mean that there is no need to have positive effect. So please explain the do no harm principle. And the second question is a question from the floor, which asks that whether you can elaborate on the role of the European Investment Bank and other EU financial intermediaries in the governance and implementation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So could you please answer those two questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So, well, do no significant harm is do no significant harm to the environment, and it's a legal requirement. Ben was referring at another approach, but well, as I said, our assessment is based on the legal requirements, and we cannot request beyond that what would be what Ben was requesting, that the measures have to really push for this digital transition, all measures. No, we have the do no significant harm, which is key, very important for the green transition, but also when I link what Ben was highlighting about how the digital transition can contribute to the green transition, this is acknowledged. And when I was highlighting this Annex 7 concerning the intervention fields in order to calculate this 20% of the investments at least going to the digital transition, it's acknowledged, the contribution of the digital to the green. So when we talk about do no significant harm, the European Commission has issued a technical notice explaining how it is going to be applied. And it takes into consideration Article 17 of the taxonomy regulation, which talks about not doing harm to the environment, to biodiversity, to climate, etc. So there are very specific, clear criteria. And in our technical notice, we developed some examples in order to make sure that it works. And for instance, when building a data center, it's necessary to demonstrate that the technology is used in order to reduce the energy that is going to be consumed by this digital data center. So these are the kind of elements. Then with regard to how European Investment Bank and then European financial intermediaries can play a role in the implementation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So with regard to the EU Investment Bank, as you know, there is this InvestEU program, and it's possible, according to one legal provision in the regulation establishing the Recovery and Resilience Facility, it is possible for member states to allocate at least 4% of their envelope under the RRF directly linked to the InvestEU. So this can be a possibility to use the European Investment Bank to implement some of the funding under the RRF. And then with regard to the role of financial intermediaries, this will depend on how member states have designed their measures. So each plan and each measure has to be described by the member state, including also how this measure is going to be implemented. And sometimes we have national promotional banks that are included in these measures, and sometimes there is no information yet about how specific measures are going to be implemented at national level, how the financial intermediaries can play a role. And this is for these national intermediaries to work with the national authorities in order to work with them to find a role. And actually, I know they are already in discussions with the member states in order to make sure that they play a role, because in some cases, the member states are not just giving grants, they are also using the RRF money in order to give loans. And these loans, of course, have to be implemented in a way so the mechanism through financial intermediaries or as said, the national promotional bank. So there might be ways, but each member state has defined or will define its own way to do it. There is no EU way to approach it, although of course there are some criteria that exist in the milestones and targets that have to be complied with, that member states have developed in order to make sure that the legal requirements of the regulation are complied with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let me follow with we are receiving many questions. So let me ask as many as in the remaining 20 minutes will allow. Now the most popular question is more a macroeconomic question. So I wonder whether any of you would like to answer. So the question says that for a lot of countries, the Recovery and Resilience Facility will only raise public investment by a very small amount, 0.1 or 0.2% of GDP per year. And the question is that what about the additional public investment needs, also considering that the European Stability and Growth Pact, European fiscal rules are rather strict. And I can add that there's a possibility that from 2023, the rules will apply again. So would any of you inclined to answer this more macroeconomic and fiscal rule related question?
I'm not going to fully answer it, but just add on observation. I mean, I think you probably heard from all of us in different ways that the issue is possibly slightly less about the actual level of investment. I mean, there's clearly a lot of money going into this, and more about how you really get the absolute biggest bang for the buck in terms of where are the really strong cases of evidence of market failure, and how do you how do you get the return from that investment. I should also say I think if the answer here is how do you digitize Europe most effectively and most quickly, we shouldn't just think here about investment from governments going into this. I mean, I think Ben touched on this earlier, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff around regulatory reform. There are a lot of levers that can be used to stimulate private sector investment that go beyond just sort of pure cash coming from government into the sector. So slightly ducking the question, but I was keen to make that point.
Many thanks.
I'm happy to chip in as well, though. If I would just say, I mean, the question's right. I mean, the level will only in and of itself shift GDP by a small amount, and let's be honest, every small amount counts, right? So we shouldn't turn our nose up at a 0.1 or 0.2% increase in GDP. You need a few of those, and suddenly it becomes quite substantial. But if you say the funds gives you a certain amount, the reforms, if that gives you, let's be simplistic, gives you an equal amount. So then you get to already 0.3, 0.4%. And then if you say, well, that would in and of them, in combination, they make Europe more competitive in the global economic race. You add another maybe 0.1, 0.2% to that. Well, already we're looking at 0.5% of GDP growth, and that's something I think we'd all happily sign up for. So yes, it's part of a bigger picture, and it contributes to resetting the European economy. But by itself, it won't be sufficient.
Scott also made a very important point earlier, which is worth keeping sight of, which is this is not just all about headline macroeconomic growth. There's a lot of stuff in here which is about sort of good social outcomes. I mean, think about the funding that goes in for training and stuff. I think a lot of our conversation today is focused on infrastructure. I think there's a really important message around the degree of training and how you keep sort of, you bring left behind communities up to speed with where the economy is going, and those are equally important.
And if I may, actually the goal is to make the economies and societies more resilient, no? European economies and societies more resilient. And here, as you all highlighted, the reforms play a key role. And I wonder at which extent these figures that have been mentioned take this into consideration. Also, what I would like to highlight is that, well, during the presentations, some of you were focusing a lot about the gaps, but actually we need to also say what is in, what this will create and how it will help in improving the situation, because it's a positive outcome. I mean, the situation of without the RRF, where it would be, no? So that's what needs to be also considered.
The counterfactual. Yes, well, actually, just reminding people, the digital part of the RRF, as you said, Maria Teresa, it's not just about creating infrastructure, it's also about dealing with social consequences caused by digitalization. And clearly, as a result of the combined effects of the pandemic, globalization, and digitalization, we have a lot of people whose work is changing in its nature. We have many areas of inequality that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so again, some of the funding can legitimately go into that. And the gains there may or may not be so visible in GDP, but they're important societal gains that we should also welcome.
Many thanks for all of you. And in fact, the next most popular question is very much related to what you said, because it's related to the participation of the private sector. And the question is how to mobilize the private sector, and the more specific question, whether there is a co-funding rate between the public and the private sector. So what's your thought? What is the best way to engage and mobilize private sector funds to reach the digital goals? Who would like to come first?
I mean, I think I'm happy to go. I mean, it's quite repetitive what has already been said. I mean, it is about the reforming the system into which private money goes. It is really important here. I mean, just as an example, just a few weeks ago when we announced our annual results and an intention to invest slightly more per annum in Europe, our share price took a significant hit. The investors looked at that increased ambition on investment as a negative due to, and we link that to the environment within which we are investing. And we want it to be the case that we announce an ambition to invest, which is met by broad support from our investors and an increase in the share price, not a decrease. And that is the reforms in agenda, first and foremost.
Yeah, it seems to me one of the mechanisms that's been used in some contexts, but it doesn't seem to me to fit the RRF, perhaps Maria Teresa will want to jump in on this, is things like loan guarantees. Effectively, the investments in many cases, there may be de facto caps on what kind of gain can be realized from investments, but often the investors are entirely open on the downside. And so there have been claims from the Commission and other programs that loan guarantees can produce as much as a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 multiplier effect on crowding in private investment. Maybe Maria, do you want to jump in here? I see you nodding.
Yes, thank you. No, you are absolutely right. And actually, in some of the plans that have been submitted, we see this type of mechanism. But as said in my initial intervention, each member state decides about its own plan. So that's why they have decided this approach, not all of them. And so, well, it's up to the member state. Thank you.
It's also worth saying, sorry, just to add on that, I think, when we talk about funding, also when we think about sort of funding of rural deployment or funding for training or something like that, that doesn't have to be one-for-one, all coming from the public sector. Often that can be targeted specifically at the area of market failure to make it more economically attractive for private sectors to invest. The other bits that I think are just worth calling out, so one is sort of on the sort of right regulatory framework about sort of having the right sort of access rules that reduce the cost of deployment of infrastructure in the first place, so more business can share whatever infrastructure there is, probably helps. And we've seen in other contexts, thinking about the kind of the underlying regulatory rules, whether it's for example allowing higher levels of return on risky infrastructure investments, for example, it could be an alternative or indeed a complement to the sort of loan guarantees that Scott was just discussing. So I think there are kind of pretty wide range of levers. I think the key thing, exactly as Maria Teresa said earlier, is on being very focused on not crowding out existing investments, so that we are intervening where it's absolutely necessary.
Actually, state aid rules are very much in this kind of direction.
We see, state aid. We see very close to home is how spectrum is managed. Obviously, in the deployment of 5G, it is critical, and already Europe has we paid billions for spectrum licenses. That's before a single bit of active equipment is deployed. Right? One has to think now longer term. Was this in the best interest of Europe in terms of where that money could have been better spent? And likewise, it's the length of time we have those spectrum licenses for. Every extra year gives us greater certainty over the holding and greater ability to invest. It's very, when you rent a house, you put very little into the house when you're coming up to a renewal if you're not sure that you're going to get the house for another year or 2 years. It's the same with spectrum, and the shorter spectrum license has a direct implication in terms of how much we're able to invest, and the longer the license, the more we can invest, and the greater the infrastructure boost would be. And we see that there is the potential to bring this into the reforms program for the RRF.
Yes, well, when we talk about regulatory reforms, I'll toss one in here. Something I've written about in the past is, in terms of those spectrum auctions, there's often a tendency for the finance minister to be writing what the reserve price for the auction is rather than the telecoms experts, in which case it's pegged at whatever the budget shortage was for the year rather than pegged at an economically efficient price. This arguably, in terms of spillover effects into the economy, is not the best way to do it. Pet peeve of mine.
Many thanks. Now I also have to watch the clock because only 10 minutes remain and still a lot of questions. Now let me ask two questions which are related to the content of the digital plans. One is a question on cybersecurity. So those of you who have looked at the plans, how do you see the proposals for enhancing cybersecurity? And the other one is many of you already talked about, is on setting priorities. I mean, many of you said that there are complementarities between different plans. Nevertheless, there is a question which is popular, which asks which should be the main digital priority like, for example, skills or connectivity or digitalization of businesses. So if you could share a few thoughts, but please very briefly, because time is now running very fast. Who would like to start?
I don't mind going first if you like. I mean, so on the British cyber, I mean, we weren't looking for cyber stuff when we were going through it specifically, so I may well have missed it in the plans. It certainly hasn't. I don't think it's certainly the focus is clearly not there. There may be some that've got some cyber elements, but I mean, Scott, jump in if you disagree. But I think I haven't really seen anything in that space. On the priorities, I mean, I think I think what the Commission have got actually is a pretty well balanced set of investments. I'm not quite sure one necessarily wants to pick off one versus the other. I mean, having a good core infrastructure and then the skills on which to use those infrastructure, I think it goes back to sort of Ben's highway analogy earlier. I think feels like sort of the right balance. If I was going to sort of say, well, where would I prioritize? I think there's clearly going to be challenges in terms of getting the social contract right about rural connectivity, and that for me is a key thing. Key digital skills of sort of disenfranchised communities feels to me as part of the sort of social contract an equally important thing. But that's my personal prejudice about where I would do it if it was me. But thankfully, I'm not a politician, so I don't have to make those choices.
Thank you, Sam.
I guess I would say it's hard to really answer the question in simple terms because again, these plans are additional to whatever has previously been funded. And also because you really have to look at them in terms of the individual gaps within the individual member states. So it's hard to give a simple one-word kind of answer. Certainly, one thing that one could think about is what are the potential multiplier effects on the various issues that have been raised. So there, I mean, if you go, for example, into the digital compass, I would say that probably ramping up innovation is one of the most important things that we can do. But that's not actually so much an RRF theme. It probably deals much more. There may be some elements of creating venture capital, equity capital, but a lot of that's going to really depend on regulatory reform, on legal reform in areas that have historically been challenging.
Just maybe just to build one point. More generally, we see some focus on the need to enhance supplier diversity within the digital value chain. We do see that this was an opportunity for some R&D funding. We haven't seen that much of it, unfortunately, come through in the national plans. But we as a company also, going back to my point earlier, collaborating with some of our industry peers are trying to innovate now around Open RAN. And we do think this is one of the areas where a greater public-private partnership could be used to enhance supply diversity in the EU.
Ben, you should probably explain what Open RAN is for our listeners. I see it as promising as a way of opening up competition. So
yeah, so Scott, you're challenging me now in terms of my ability to describe technical features in a way which I wasn't necessarily cut out to. But if I describe it as simply as I understand it, traditionally, so take our mobile networks, when we deploy active equipment, the hardware and the software are one and the same. Well, they're a combined piece. What Open RAN does is it separates the hardware layer from the software layer. So you can have a hardware deployed by one vendor, but have software deployed by someone else. And we think this enhances the potential diversity within the supply chain, and also allows us to take greater control over some of the most important areas of the supply chain in terms of cybersecurity to enhance it. So we're strongly backing Open RAN as a solution, both for diversity but also cybersecurity reasons. And we think it's something that the government should be interested in and really invest in jointly with us.
Essentially opens up more competition within the entire value chain for the network.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, I also noticed a very interesting question, which is related to fundamental rights of EU citizens. Namely, the question says that when measuring the success of the digital Digate targets, will the respect of fundamental rights of citizens aligned to European values would be used as a criteria? I mean, probably it means privacy and related issues are at the core of this question. Nevertheless, either if Maria Teresa or any other of you have some thoughts on that, I think it would be very interesting to discuss. But again, we have only 5 minutes left, so please try to be brief.
No, thank you. No, concerning fundamental rights, what is clear is that member states, when implemented their plans, they have to comply with the fundamental rights. I said the issue about comply with state aid rules, but no, they have to comply with fundamental rights, they have to comply with public procurement rules, they have to comply with environmental rules. So this goes without saying, but I like now that the question came on fundamental rights to reinforce it. So member states have to comply with the legal frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just say for us, this is critical as well. We are on a journey of much greater digitalization through all elements of society and economy, and we have to bring citizens along with us, and it has to be in compliance with European values. And people have to trust in the digitalization that's going to happen in the years ahead, because if they don't trust, it won't work. And I think we already see breakdowns of trust in certain areas, which is not helpful for digitalization, and that has to be remedied. And we certainly see ourselves being part of that.
Many thanks. Now, probably, we still have about 6 questions, so I have to select. Let me select the one which asks about the possible flaws. So, the question says, what could you elaborate the possible flaws of the plans? Also in regard European competitiveness towards the US and China, but also more generally, what risks do you see that the plans or that implementation might carry in the years to come? And maybe this would be the final closing round, because we only 3 minutes left. So maybe let's go in a reverse order, starting with Scott and then closing with Maria Teresa. So Scott, please.
Ooh, well, I haven't looked at the plans in enough detail to have anything very concrete to say. As far as competition with China and US, there's some interesting bits here to the extent that it promotes multi-country collaborations on certain kinds of critical research, for example, and these were visible in the multi-country plans. That could actually play an important role. If we consider, for example, areas like artificial intelligence and big data, the amount of public and private funding in the United States and in China is just vastly greater than in the European Union. There's already been some attempts to work on this at European level. But there, to the extent, if this can create a bit of a shot in the arm to research in critical technologies like that, that could be important. There are bits that relate to quantum computing and other things that show up again in the multi-country plans. I'm thinking here actually more of digital decade rather than RRF, but hopefully it's been reflected into RRF. Those could be important. Thanks.
Many thanks. Just let me enlarge the question a bit. So in more general, what are the major risks of the plan? So you might not need to be country specific, but would it relate to implementation, or would it relate to building highways parallel to each other, or so what risks? What are the major risks that you see in general? But also, if you want to comment specific plans, you are also welcome. So Ben, please.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I guess the major risk is that we get over ambitious on projects which won't deliver value. So, and maybe people like myself talking about the race with the US and China doesn't help, in that we think therefore we have to be competitive in every aspect of the digital ecosystem against those two giant economic powers. But for me, that's not the case. We have to look at where Europe can play to its strengths, and having a much better functioning single market or digital single market will certainly help in that regard. But what we need to avoid is making big investments in areas where in the end we won't be able to compete now because we're too far behind. So let's be realistic about what are Europe's strengths, how we can improve in the coming years rapidly to catch up with where US and China are, and play to those strengths in the short term, and recognizing that the next big thing like AI, let's just hope that Europe is driving it rather than the US and China.
Many thanks. Sam, please.
Probably sort of less on flaws and probably more on one of the sort of challenges here, which is I think the point's been made already in the discussion that this is clearly one of a series of overlapping schemes that exist both at sort of European and national level. And I could imagine the European Commission will have a very interesting and challenging time in trying to pick through all of these submissions and trying to work out exactly where the incremental effects from the proposed investments. And I think I'd sort of just add to that, but certainly from the review that we've done of the plans as they stand to date, they are, probably necessarily, given the time, quite a high level. And I would imagine that there's probably going to be a need to be sort of have increasing specificity in some areas that will perhaps help flesh out some of these challenges.
Thank you. So now it's my turn. So just to say, the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a performance-based facility, meaning that those reforms and investments have to be implemented in order for the European Commission to be able to disburse the funds. Therefore, the key challenge is a good implementation. And the regulation itself, and therefore each individual plan, will have built in the relevant safeguards to make sure, for instance, there is no double funding, protection of EU financial interests, no conflicts of interest, no corruption. All this is built in. And what is built in also is a clear schedule for milestones and targets in order to follow the implementation of the relevant reforms and investments. So the clear challenge is to make sure that this calendar for the fulfillment of milestones and targets is implemented. And that's why we from the European Commission, we are encouraging all member states in this implementation phase to really encourage them to talk and to work with all the relevant stakeholders, being on the private side, being social partners, being relevant authorities, in order to make sure that the implementation is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a very nice closing word, because indeed 23 plans have been submitted. In a few weeks, the assessments by the Commission will be published. Then the Council will make a decision, and hopefully by the end of the summer, also the first disbursements from the Quant will start, and countries can start to implement it. And indeed, I think all of us, we have a major task in following and assessing implementation. So with that closing note, let me thank to all of you, to Maria Teresa, Sam, Ben, and Scott for participating in this very insightful discussion. I hope also the audience have joined that. So just thank you very much, both all four of you, and also all participants who followed this seminar. And please keep looking at our events webpage, because we are going to have many other events also related to the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So thank you again, and see you soon.